once you get within 8 weeks from lambing, you're into that late pregnancy period. The later you go after that, the riskier it gets. So the more potential issues you can have between the diet, but also between transport and that extra movement, etc. That all has to be factored in when you're debating the longer you leave them out on these crops. And the other side of this too is, as you come closer to lambing, what you end up with is your energy and protein requirements are increasing. If you're not getting the nutrient requirements right at that stage, you'll end up burning a lot of body condition score. It's not worth burning that condition score off them for the sake of an extra couple of weeks where we don't have to put them in the shed and bed them and feed them. We'll get a much more benefit out of getting them off in time and getting them onto their late pregnancy diet and making sure we keep the body condition score on them.
Hello, I'm Kieran Lynch and welcome to OviCast, the Teagasc Sheep podcast. Each episode will bring you latest insights, advice and technical updates for the sheep industry. Dr. Frank Campion joins us this week as we discuss grazing management and forage brassicas. Frank discusses the yields with us and why we should do a budget for the crop. We discuss intakes, utilisation and the various factors that influence it. Frank discusses fencing, crop allocation and managing in wet conditions. He also offers some words of caution and advice for managing the crop in frosty conditions. We finish up discussing transition off the crop both for finishing lambs and pregnant ewes. We hear now from Frank.
It is a very good outlet for some. I suppose some people have been at this a good number of years now and probably know a lot of the pitfalls and the benefits of it that come with it. But I suppose as we get started on it, and I suppose just to clarify, when we're chatting about forage brassica crops, we're talking about those above ground ones. So it's your forage rape, your hybrid brassica, and in some cases maybe even kale. But I suppose there's a few kind of rules and regulations and guidelines you need to follow to, first of all, make sure you're compliant with everything, but also to make sure that you get the most out of the crop and make sure that the animals on it perform to their best. And I suppose the first thing we probably start with is looking at yield and looking at yield estimation. And I suppose it's no different than when we talk about grass. It can often seem like a thing that an alien concept that I don't need to do, but it's like with any forage, if you don't know what you have, it's very hard to make the budget out and decide how you're going to manage it.
And I suppose, Frank, if you're going to try and ration that out, depending on what the crop is like, and we'll come to that in a moment, it is important you know how much is there and what they're going to eat. That you have put a stab at it, that you have X amount of weeks on this crop, all going well.
Look, that's the thing, Kieran, because there's no point. It's about cutting your cloth to measure. So there's no point having enough crop there for 50 lambs and you'll say you'll be able to finish them off and putting 100 lambs on it and finding out 2 weeks later that suddenly you're out of crop and you've nothing finished off it and you've no option of, or very limited options of what else you can do with those lambs. Likewise, if you're putting ewes onto it, for some people they'll be looking at using this as a buffer now so that they're not housing till maybe 6 or 8 weeks out from lambing. And if you do yield estimation and find that we'll look at you're well behind in that, well then maybe the option is to put some of your ewes, particularly your thinner type ewes, into the house and let some of your other ewes graze on, so that at least you get to keep some of them out on it right up until that kind of 6 to 8 weeks out from lambing. So that's where your yield estimation comes in.
It lets you make the management decisions. Just would you maybe take me through the basics? How would you go about estimating yield and what kind of intakes utilisation do you expect to get in ewes and lambs?
So look, in terms of the yield, it's slightly different from doing our grass yield. So our grass yield, we can have our 0.25 metre by 0.25 metre square quadrant. For forage crops, it's basically a bigger quadrant. It's a metre by a metre square is what you need to cut. And ideally, you kind of cut that in 2 or 3 different places in the field. I suppose 3 in your bigger plots and maybe 2 in a smaller field. And the reason we use the bigger square for the forage crops is basically when you look at them, at fields of these forage crops, they look like they're really thick and closed in canopy, which they are. But when you cut the canopy off it, what you can often see at the bottom is that the stems or the stalks are quite separated out and quite widely spaced at the bottom. So by using the bigger quadrant, it gives us a more accurate estimate of what's actually in the crop. So you cut your metre by metre square, and look, you don't need to necessarily go with a pre-made square. Even if you have a measuring tape or something that you just measure out your square and mark it with a couple of white posts and then cut everything within it, that does as well. Put it into something like a meal bag or a bin bag, something like that you can bring it back in, put it on a hanging scales and get a weight on it. And then with that weight, put an estimate on dry matter. And generally these crops will range somewhere around 12 to 13% dry matter. And I suppose what we've seen over the years in that and rye is that your stemmier or much heavier type crops can maybe creep up towards 14 or 15%. And then your lighter type crops where you have a lot of leaf or sub-stem in it could be maybe slightly closer to 10%. But somewhere around 12 to 13% should give you a reasonably accurate estimation. And basically, you convert that back to kilos of dry matter per hectare. So what you do is you take your fresh weight, you multiply it by your dry matter, you multiply it by 10,000 then, which brings it up to per hectare basis, and that'll give you your dry matter yield per hectare. And I suppose when you're working it out, then it depends on the type of animal that you're going grazing on it. I suppose the safest thing to do when you want to is to allow kind of 3 to 4% of body weight as your intake. And that should allow then for your not utilizing 100% of the crop, and that'll give you a fair estimation of what's in it. And I suppose the one thing just to mention on utilizations is they can vary quite widely with these types of crops, and there's a number of reasons for that. The first thing that'll make it vary is weather. So even if you take the last couple of weeks that we've had, Kieran, we've gone from very dry, kind of nice weather to really heavy rainy days. And I suppose, you can go, we've seen with the lamb trials in Athenry that we've gone from days where we might be getting 70 to 80% utilization. A couple of days later, we could be down to 40% utilization. And I suppose the key is to be always ready that where you are fencing blocks or fencing areas off, is that you have a strip or a block ready for them to move on to if you do, when you get those bad days, that you keep the intake right within them. So look, Kieran, in terms of your utilization, put your lambs grazing in reasonable weather, you're probably going to look somewhere around 60 to 65% for your forage rape, your hybrid brassicas. What we've seen is with your kale, particularly with lambs grazing it, that's about kind of anywhere between 8 and 10% lower than that, just because it tends to be a more stem in it, and it's harder for the lambs and even for ewes to graze that out that bit more, so you get a lower utilization. But I think if you were going in and looking at kind of 65% utilization, you'd be relatively safe.
And look, I suppose we need to just be conscious here. That's between damage on leaves in being trampled on weather and just what they're not eating or what you're not trying to force them to eat, particularly in the case of finishing lamb.
Yeah, look, and that's the compromise, and it's probably the same with any type of grazing crop, be it grass or forage basket or whatever. You can go in and force the lambs to graze this out and get really high utilizations, but you won't get the performance out of the lamb. So it's about getting that balance where you're getting good utilization out of the crop, that it's, I suppose, worth your while, and you're getting a good grazing period out of it, but also that you're keeping the lambs or even the ewes performing on it, so that you're keeping them growing or not burning body to score off them. So it's about finding that happy spot with that. And generally what we've seen is around 60 or 65% is where we're falling on that at the minute.
I think that's what's important, even in the context of ewes. Certainly you could get more out of it, whether you should get more out of it, and force the ewes to lose condition or mobilize condition is the other question. I think you're right, you shouldn't. Look, if we talk about where the crops are at this year, probably a difficult enough start for a lot of them. Look, you're growing up for the last couple of years. Maybe just give me a snapshot of what you typically have seen and what kind of yield you're getting, and maybe what you're seeing around the country this year and what impact that might have.
Yeah, so looking for in Athenry, anyway, what we've done is we've sown crops. We sowed crops in early July and we sowed crops again in early August. And I suppose the crop sown in early July probably struggled a little bit insofar as it was a relatively or comparatively colder summer than what we'd be used to. We got dry periods and cold periods and things like that, and it didn't get the start we would have liked. What we saw with the later sown crops is they were very slow to get going, but we got that comparatively mild October compared to what we'd be used to, and that really helped them catch up and get back to where we would like them to be. So it hasn't been an ideal year for growing these crops, and I suppose probably the reasonably good weather in October and early November, in a sense, bailed them out and allowed yields to catch up a bit to where we want them to be. But I suppose what we are seeing is for, in those lighter type crops that were a bit later growing, some of the stem and stuff on them is quite actually light and weak on them, where it's increasing the utilization just because the lambs are able to graze more of it and graze it out quite quickly. And it's something that probably has to be watched in all crops this year, that they do tend to motor through it a small bit quicker just because there's more of it that's utilizable.
And Frank, this is probably where it's a little bit different than if you're grazing with cattle, where probably you make more use of that heavy crop as well. But certainly with sheep, and you've seen that, and you've indicated there, you can sometimes that medium crop that's not maybe hitting the upper end of the yield nearly does as well.
Yeah, and that's the thing. So look, we would have seen this over the years. We would have been growing crops that were kind of 6.5 to 7 tons on average, and we were utilizing somewhere in the order of about 60% of that on average. Okay. And I suppose what we've seen now this year is that, maybe growing that slightly lighter crop, so it might be 2 or 3 tons slightly behind those crops. We're looking to see, well, do we get as much out of that in terms of the fact that we're getting a higher utilization? So just to give you an example, some of our forage rape crops, so we're yielding these as we move through them. And some of those crops that we put in early July, the yield at the minute is just shy of 6 ton. So slightly back from where we would have been in other years, but like I said, that's a year effect as much as anything, just because they got such a bad start. And then when we look at some of the later sown crops, which were into the first week in August, they're only about a ton behind. And I suppose we would have expected that gap to be slightly higher based on what we would have seen in other years. Like I said, that's down to the year effect. But what we are seeing with those later crops is our utilization at the minute, and we're only a month on them now. So we have to do the full winter before we can put a proper, I suppose, summarization on this. But they are utilising that bit more of them and they're grazing them out a bit more just because they're softer and there's a much higher leaf to stem ratio than what we'd normally see.
It's just one of them other things you have to factor in as well. But it's a positive too for somebody that's a little bit behind with the crop. You could actually get a bit more out of it than you'd expect. Look, we talked about yield, we talked about the impact of this year. Management on these crops is going to have a bearing too. So I'm kind of thinking of this, Frank, from two aspects. One, getting the most out of it for the animals, but also there's a practical element to it as well. Like it has to be feasible and work. Talk to me a little bit about fencing it, setting it up, how you'd go about grazing, what impact that can have.
Yeah, so look at the typical example I give with this, Kieran, when it comes to grazing. If you take a lamb, we could let them in and we could let them run across the whole field and just pick the leaf off of them. We get fabulous growth rates and we'd be delighted with ourselves, but we'd only get a quarter of the grazing time out of it that we should, and that's no good. Equally, as I said earlier, could let them in, could let them graze every leaf and bit of stem out of it, and we'd be delighted to say, geez, they cleaned off the field lovely, but we wouldn't get any growth rate. So it's about finding that happy medium. And the way I suppose we've been managing over the years to do that is, first of all, you get your yield, but then you're going in with your electric fence then to give it to them in blocks, essentially. So at the moment, what we're doing is we're giving the lambs 3-day allocations. Look, some people will give 4, 5, 6-day allocations. But what's important within it is that within those allocations that they're spending more time grazing the leaf and the sub-leaf, which is the most nutritious part of it, rather than spend a number of days trying to graze out the stalk to the place where you want it. So the way we're trying to set it up at the minute is that the lambs are spending the first 2 days, maybe a little bit more, grazing the leaf and the sub stem, and then they're a day or half a day even just grazing that bit of stem, that soft bit of stem near the top, and then they're moving on again. So they're constantly getting that fresh supply of forage. What we're doing is we're using 4 strands of just your normal polyelectric wire. We have Scottish blackface lambs bought in Connemara on it, and by and large they're respecting it and have over the last 4 or 5 years we've been doing this. So if we can get them to stay behind the electric wire, I'm fairly confident you get any type of sheep to stay behind it. And the other thing we're doing then is, as we cut our strips or our blocks, we're putting extra fences in front of them, so if they do break through one wire, they can't get too far ahead up the field and have the whole crop maybe walked on or desiccated over a night or over a day if we didn't get to see them from morning to evening. So there's constantly 2 or 3 strip wires in front of them.
That's what I just going to say, like for the practical element of it there, probably battery fences is what a lot are going to rely on. And again, the caveat there is a battery fence is only spec for a single strand. So a kilometre, if you divide it up on 3 or 4 strands like yours and 4, is really only fit for 250. So it has to be appropriate for, but the idea of having the next block set up ahead, like even for a practical point of view, when you go to wind it up again and move them, it's one of them simple things to keep having done. And maybe it's something you could do at a weekend or a day where you're free and have it set up for the week or week and a half grazing ahead.
Oh, look, that's the thing, and it does make it much more practical. There's no reason you couldn't go out on a Saturday there with a bit of help and set up your entire week's worth of grazing. And you're set up, and like I said earlier, if you do then have let's say you get a very wet day like we got the weekend before last, and you suddenly need, instead of your leaving them in it for 4 or 5 days, you suddenly need to move them after 2. It's very easy. Lift the wires on that wet day, let them in, let them ahead again, and then you're set up again. Like, so you're not forcing them on a wet or a bad day to graze stuff when the utilization drops. So it gives you a lot of control over it, and it gives you a lot of, I suppose, a lot of power then to make sure that you're managing the crop in the best way possible.
And look, for those maybe going in on ground where they're getting this grazing, that set up, like the long and narrow setup versus giving them a wider block. From a utilization point of view, I suppose that's also helping.
Yeah, exactly. So it's, I suppose, what we will try and say is long and narrow is better than short and wide. And I suppose what you're really trying to avoid is you can't have a situation where you're grazing them like a feed space, where basically you have a line of lambs and they're only getting enough fresh grazing that it's basically they're able to line up along the line and graze at a feed face. You're not allowed to do that. You need to give them enough that they're able to walk in around it and graze it. But like I said, long and narrow will give you that sort of option, and that's far better, and you'll get far better utilization and easier to manage. And then I suppose the other thing with that, I should have mentioned with the fence, is the one thing we are doing is we knock a strip down where the wire is going, just so that the crop isn't touching the fence, because it's a very low dry matter crop, so a lot of water in it. So if the wire is touching some of them crops, it'll drain the power out of it very quickly. And for some people, they'll just drive the quad up the line and then they'll put the wire behind it. We use a strimmer just because it's a small area, and all it'll just drop down the crop where you want to put the wire. is important.
Quad tractor wheel aren't going to put that brake in
Yeah,
the fire. No,
exactly.
slip
I think
up.
they'll
And
put the brakes
again,
in.
nothing quicker to figure out if fences off than sheep. Um, let's just take it another step. Look, in the past week or two, we've seen a bit of frosty weather coming in. We've had relatively mild winters recently, but
Mm.
the impact of frost on some of them crops, and maybe just talk to me about that and how you go about managing it.
Yeah, so look, frost is not the friend of these crops. So I'll give you an example. 2 or 3 years ago in Athenry, we had in early December, we had a week where it froze all week and it didn't actually thaw. So it started freezing on the Monday morning and we didn't get a thaw until the Friday. And what we ended up actually happening was a lot of the crop got killed, or at least and the stuff that didn't get killed was really severely damaged, and so far we lost a lot of yield out of it. What we're getting the last couple of weeks is we're getting these frosty nights, but it's thawing out during the day. Look, it does make the crop look a little bit miserable the next day when it thaws out. It looks a bit shook, but we haven't had any major damage to it yet. The key thing with that is where you get a frozen crop is that you don't let lambs in on top of fresh frozen crop. So if we go out in the morning and we're due to move fences and it's frozen, we'll wait until midday or afternoon until it's thawed out, and then we'll let them into the crop. And basically, not to not to overly complicate it, basically you can't be grazing that frozen crop because it changes the chemical composition of the crop essentially, and will make it slightly poisonous to the animal, and you'll end up with flock health issues if you start grazing frozen crops. Look, for people who are block grazing and you'll get the question, oh look, they're grazing and it's already frozen, nothing you can do there, they're in on it. What you don't want to do is give them a fresh allocation and they go in and suddenly starts gorging on that frozen leaf. So at the minute where we're getting the thaw in the middle of the day, that's working out fine. Where you get that prolonged frozen period, what you might actually have to do is go in with some supplementary feeding, be it some concentrates or put in a forage like a bit of hay or a bit of silage just to keep the lambs full and keep them eating while you're going through that frozen patch.
Have the option of a buffer there.
Yeah.
It probably leads us on to just the next aspect of it in terms of buffers. We talk about transition of these crops, and I'm thinking of it both for the case of the pregnant ewe and that finishing lamb. So we'll go back to where I started, but you maybe deal with the lamb one first. As that crop starts to run out, maybe the lambs aren't as far on as you expected. Maybe you have some still there to finish. Having a plan in place so as you come towards the end of it to transition them off it, from the lamb point of view first maybe, and then we'll talk about it as well from the ewe point of view, how close to pregnancy feeding. But you do have to have a plan in place for the latter end of grazing as well.
Yeah, and I think to be fair, Kieran, if we even go back a step, you need to have a plan going on to the crop and you need to have the plan coming off the crop. So look, there's new regulations around grazing these crops that everyone who's sowing them and grazing them will be aware of. So animals on it will have a constant run back to a grass lie-back now. So that'll take care of the forage source in the diet. But when you're putting them onto it, they still need to be introduced to it slowly so that they kind of adapt to the diet. So basically these type of forage, brassicas, are usually highly digestible. It's a bit like introducing concentrates. If we were to introduce concentrates without any adaptation, we'd end up with acidosis and health issues. It's the same thing with the forage crops. So with the grass lie-back, we probably don't have to do the same level of belts and braces adaptation we would have done where they're going onto it full time, but they still need to be adapted onto it so they get used to it and the rumen gets a chance to adapt and we get them going on it. And it's the same process then coming off it. And that's where your yield comes into a degree too. So what we would do with the lambs is when we would see looking at the yields that we're kind of 2 weeks out from running out of crop, we'll have a look. And, invariably every year we have a bunch of lambs that aren't going to finish off the crop. They'll have grown well, they'll have put on frame, but they'll be heading for indoor feeding after that. So we start adapting them onto the diet that they're changing onto. So in our situation, we'll start introducing concentrates, get them used to eating, get them trained to eating. So by the time we house them, they're actually eating some concentrates, and it's not a complete dietary change that they go through then when they're put into the shed. If we were to just take them off the crop and start feeding them concentrates straight away, it's a big change on the animal. We'll drop performance. We'll end up with potential flock health issues in some of them, and we're basically could undo some of the good work we've done while we're grazing the crop. And it's a similar story then from the ewes, which is obviously they're not going to be going to the factory. They're coming off the crop and on into the shed and it's about getting them used to the diet they're going on to. So putting out some silage, putting out some concentrates with them while they're on that crop, coming near the end of it, so that when they come into the house, they're actually used to that diet. And it's probably, I won't say it's more important with the ewe, but you'll probably see the negative effects if you don't do this right more quickly with the ewe. Insofar as putting the ewes into it, they're probably 6 to 8 weeks out from lambing. A dietary change here that's not done right you'll start to see more negative health effects that's going to affect your spring in a much more visible way in terms of sick ewes, potentially lost lambs, lost lamb performance, etc. So it's important that you get that transition off right. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. It's just about getting them used to the diet they're going on to when they come off the crop.
Look, there probably is a reluctance we use there to keep them, well, an acceptance to keep them running longer for a grazing point of view, and it's saving them bedding, saving straw, saving a lot of things maybe, but it does get riskier the closer to the lamb when you leave that, even with a transition in place, just for the sheer physical movement, repenning, all the headaches that come with that as well.
Look, yeah, and you'll hear stories and anecdotes all around the country of, I left the ewes out until this late and that long and it worked fine for me, and, that's fine. But once you get within 8 weeks from lambing, you're into that late pregnancy period. The later you go after that, the riskier it gets. So the more potential issues you can have, as you said, not even between the diet, but also between transport and that extra movement, etc. So, that all has to be factored in when you're debating the longer you leave them out on these crops. And the other side of this too is, as you come closer to lambing, what you end up with is your energy and protein requirements are increasing and your intake is dropping. And that's a whole other story that I'm sure you'll do in another podcast. But if you're not getting the nutrient requirements right at that stage, you'll end up burning a lot of body ignition score. And I think we talked a couple of weeks ago about the importance of keeping body ignition score on ewes. We talked about last week for hill ewes, same for lowland ewes. It's not worth burning that condition score off them for the sake of an extra couple of weeks where we don't have to put them in the shed and bed them and feed them. We'll get a much more benefit out of getting them off in time and getting them onto their late pregnancy diet and making sure we keep the body condition score on them.
Yeah, look, it could be an option, Frank. In some of these cases, there could be other classes of stock there that you could graze and not be replaced when your lambs are dry, or otherwise they could make use of a tail end crop that's already there.
Yeah, look, we've had that example with the better farmers before. We've had a number of better farmers who've grown these type crops. They've had ewes and lambs on it. And I suppose they've taken the decision, we get to early January for a maritime flock, we're going to put in the ewes, but the dry ewe lambs can go on and clean off the rest of that. They might have some tail end lambs themselves knocking around, will go on and clean up the rest of that. So it's not as if it needs to go to waste. There is other stock there that can take it. I suppose the one thing to be conscious of as we get later in the winter, once those forage crops start to flower, so once we start to see that yellow flower come on, they're gone past grazing at that stage, and any stock that's on it should be taken off it at that stage.
I think that's important. Look, Frank, appreciate that update. I know you've been on 2 weeks in a row. I'll give you a break for a while, but thanks very much for coming back to us this week.
Thanks, Kieran.
Okay, we'll leave it there for this week's episode. I'd like to thank Frank again for coming on with, I think, some useful advice for those grazing those crops or even those interested in that area. That's it for me. For updates from our sheep programme, keep an eye on our Twitter page at Teagasc Sheep. I'm Kieran Lynch. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us wherever you get your podcasts.